Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cloud Security Lounge, episode number 4. Today, we have Michael Dawson here.
Hello.
Node.js lead for Red Hat and IBM. Part of the technical steering committee member for Node.js. And project council member for the OpenJS Foundation cross-project team. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, nice to be here.
It's great to have you. And just a word for our listeners, usually you would see JB here leading the proceedings, but he's been called away on very interesting business. So I'm going to try to cover for him, and hopefully I'm not going to do too bad of a job. So before we go into this whole thing, we invited Michael here to talk about, of course, Node.js, something that he knows well from the inside and out. And we hope to look at some of the aspects of the whole security ecosystem around Node.js. So my personal caveat, I am not a front-end person, which led me to not be a JavaScript person, which led me to sort of miss the whole Node.js revolution. And sometimes I do feel that, yes, I'm missing something, but the bits and pieces that I'm able to get here and there, and especially the security aspects of it, they look extremely interesting. And I know that some people embrace it with all their might and go deep into it, like we tend to do with things that interest us. And so I wanted to open up with something a bit more basic, something to those of us that operate on my level. So can you give us a bit of an overview of what's Node.js, why is it so important, what are people using it for, especially why is it so important in cloud environments and stuff like that?
Sure. So, Node.js basically provides an environment where you can run JavaScript on the back end. We've all used JavaScript in the browser when we're running, Chrome or IE. And in fact, today, whether you're using the same JavaScript engine, V8, in Chrome and IE, and that's what we actually have in Node.js as well. So in the browser gives the environment so that you can access the outside world, open sockets, write to files, whatever, right? On the back end, you need something that gives you that equivalent functionality. And so Node provides that additional set of APIs in addition to JavaScript, where you can basically interact with the outside world. And that, as fundamentally, is what it does for you.
Got it. So V8, which I understand is the engine that runs Node.js, is that sort of like a headless browser?
Yeah, basically it's what runs JavaScript, but it doesn't give you the pieces which will interact with your UI on the screen. And if you wanted to open a socket, it doesn't give you the functions to open and write to sockets. It just implements what's in the I shouldn't say just, but like it implements what's in the ECMAScript spec. And the browser provides you all of the rest of the pieces that you need to do that interaction with the outside world. You can look at it as a headless. It doesn't even really give you, I think you can build it, but by default, it won't necessarily even give you like a command line interface or anything like that. That's something that you can sort of wrap around the execution of JavaScript as well.
Got it. So that's interesting, because one thing that I heard was that one of the reasons why it's so popular is that it lets you have a continuum between the front end and the back end. Like people who know JavaScript from the front end are able to go to the back end, work there, and sort of have this continuity, right?
Yes, that's related to one. I think the two real reasons, or two major reasons I see people using Node is one, like developer productivity and performance. And so, on the developer productivity side, being able to have teams where, your JavaScript experience and what you're doing on the front end is not like completely different from what you're doing on the back end. Part of the reason you get the productivity is because because of that kind of reason, but that's not really the only reason. I think it's the style, right? Like if you look at a compiled language with types, you have a whole bunch of steps. And so the iterative development cycle just tends to be slower. And so, the reason that people, like it and use it is it lets you move really fast and it lets you iterate quickly. And sort of part of that, not necessarily all of that, but a part of that is that it's a language that maybe you're already using on your front end side. And I think, it's still a bit of a different domain working on the back end or front end. So it's not necessarily that you're going to have one person who does both sides, but it's kind of like you've got two teams. If you do have two teams, and I mean, there are people who will do both, but if you have two teams, they're both speaking the same language. And you can imagine that, that helps in communication versus, if you were speaking different languages, right?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. But then the security person in me has to come up and say, okay, but between the front end and the back end, if we look at it from the angle of security, aren't we looking at very different, almost domains? And are we, if we had this continuity of people, not only of commonality of language, but if we say, hey, because everybody's writing in JavaScript, they are able to jump from one to the other, are we being a bit naive in here, expecting that the security problems on both sides are the same?
Well, that's kind of what I was saying, is that, like, even though you're speaking the same language, they still end up being a little bit of different domains. Like, you still, working on the back end is a different domain from the front end. There's different skills required, and I think the front end might be, I'm not sure everybody will agree with this one, but like might be a little bit more artistic.
Yes.
If you see my presentations, they're more like stickman, and I've mostly worked on the back end. Whereas I see some presentations from people who work on the front end. They're fantastic. They're really beautiful. And I can see like those are different skills between the two sides of things. So I agree with you that they're still different domains, but I still come back to, I have a much easier time if I speak English and the person I'm working with speaks English versus I'm speaking English and, they're working in a different language, right? So there's still some benefit, even if there's not 100% overlap in that particular case. And in terms of security, you're right that there's different things that you have to worry about in that context, but really that's just one of the things where it's a bit different.
Okay, so it's basically one language with two or more dialects, and we could say that security is the divisor in one of them. I mean, front-end people will look at one set of problems, back-end people at a different set. Cool.
Right, it's like different problems, but you're working potentially in the same language, and you can share and identify maybe a little bit more easily than you would be otherwise.
So in that sense, I understand that Node.js from the beginning had security as a main value. That there was
certainly the Node project has always had security and how we ship and build the binaries very much something that has been a core value. If you look at our CI infrastructure, we have two CIs, one which is our test CI. We have a separate one that's much more locked down for what we use to build our binaries that we ship. And we've got a 26-step security release process, which we built up over the years in terms of trying to make sure that like we pre-notify the people who are interested. We have dependent teams. We have a container team. So when we do a Node.js release that we ship on Node.js.org, they want to bundle those into containers. So we let them know ahead of time. And so, over the years, the project, and it really from the very beginning was set up to think about security and how we sort of build and do that in a safe way.
And before actually we go back to those 26 steps, which I think it's really interesting, one thing that jumped at me was that you guys are publishing your threat model, which is not something that you commonly see, right?
Yeah,
so
it's fairly recent.
Tell me a bit about that there.
Well, yeah, sorry, that it's fairly recent for us. It's the accepting security vulnerability reports and triaging them and managing them. That's actually a fairly tough process. And if anybody's figured out an easy way to do that, let me know. So out of that, and out of, I guess I'd almost say like out of some of our frustrations of that work, we figured it would be good to document, what do we think is a vulnerability? What do we not think is a vulnerability? Even for our internal discussions, because that's often a very difficult thing to figure out. It's like, okay, this is a concern, but is it something that we think is a concern in terms of the model? So for example, for Node, our fundamental assumption today is that like we trust the code that you ask us to run. And so therefore, lots of things flow out of that. If you ask us, for example, to load a really, really big file, and that causes the runtime to fall over because it's so big that it's exhausted all the resources, we're like, well, that's not a vulnerability because you asked us to do that and you asked us to run that code. Whereas if you ask us to do something and an unexpected side effect, like or I don't know, it's even in that case, it's sometimes hard to draw that very good line. So that's why our threat model is the effort to say, this is what we trust, this is what we don't trust. And so if something that we trust causes an issue, then that's likely not a vulnerability. If something that we don't trust, so for example, when you're running a server and a remote client connects to you, we don't trust the requests that are going to come from the outside, right? And if they can cause us to fall over, then that is likely a vulnerability, right? So it gives us a framework to have those discussions internally. Also, hopefully, to set expectations with people who are reporting vulnerabilities, because often, people invest a lot of time and effort, and they don't necessarily want to hear that we don't think that that's a vulnerability. So the sooner we can sort of set the context, the better, right? Because often friction comes out of like misaligned expectations or misunderstanding. Yes. And yeah, we looked around. I think there were a few others that had, something along a threat model, but not as many as I was hoping for when we went into it. I really hoped we'd find some good examples. We would leverage those examples, but unfortunately, not so much.
So I can attest that it's a very lively discussion happening now in the threat modeling community, to publish or not to publish and what to publish. Right. And one of the things that I really liked in what the Node project put out is that in the sense of a threat model, it's actually not pointing out at those things that you guys considered could go wrong, but it's more of a definition of the things that you trust in building a trust boundary around the core of the project and saying, hey, you know what? It's a shared responsibility. We're running this thing. We're giving you all the services, but what you ask those services to do, that's your problem. Yep. So we're giving you the Legos. If you want to step on them, it's your thing.
Yeah.
And as you said, that makes things very, very clear to, again, as somebody who has been on the receiving side of security reports, you're not getting as many bogus or weak things that would probably divert a lot of the attention and the time that you guys put on it. So,
or things that we can't necessarily do anything about, right?
Right.
But there are many concerns that are not necessarily, like we wouldn't necessarily consider them a node vulnerability, but they're still important. And so we did spend some work building out a best practices document where we outlined, here's some concerns. We don't consider them vulnerabilities because, they're outside of that trust model. However, here are some ways to mitigate that in your applications and take care of those things. So, we don't want to say that things outside our model aren't important, but they're just, you need to address them potentially in your application instead of in the runtime themselves.
Yeah. So for those who are interested, we are going to put this on the notes for the episode, but all this stuff can be found on the security.md file in the Node project GitHub. So that's the place to go. Another thing, you have an OSSF criticality score on the scorecard of 7.3 out of 10. And I think that's pretty high. And I would like to hear a bit of your experience with the scorecard and how important you see that being.
The scorecard. So the two things, the criticality score. So, everybody seems to use Node.js and JavaScript. I think it's used in a broad number of ways. So it's used for the backend APIs as your traditional server, but it's also used in the pipelines where we're building applications, in scripting. And so it has a really wide sort of, I think, I don't know if surface area is the right way, but like a large area, a large number of places that it uses. And that led, I think, to the criticality score in terms of the OSSF and why it's like one of the top projects that they wanted to support. In terms of the scorecard itself, That's something, an effort more recent by the security working group. Maybe I'll step back a little bit. We were very grateful to get some funding from the OSSF from the last 2 years. That helped us have, an individual in the project whose, main goal is security and helping to improve security within Node.js. So both on the, like the tactical, like, hey, we've got reports, we got to work on them, fix them, but also in the longer term, like how can we make the project more proactive? And part of that has been to get the security working group to work on the OSSF scorecards, which we've added to a few repositories to sort of get up and running. And we found that it has been useful in like pointing out some things that we wouldn't necessarily think about because we're developers and we're more focused on building out functionality sometimes than specific things that can help the supply chain. So for example, one of the things that pointed out is, hey, you've used specific versions of actions in your workflows as opposed to pinning them to particular hashes. And so we've started pinning them to hashes because that's the recommendations, and there's tools that can help you keep those up to date. So it's been useful from that perspective, as well as pointing out some other specific things that, like, sometimes we look at them and like we're not sure quite how we can apply them, and in those cases we're going to give some feedback back to the scorecard team. And in other cases it's like some specific, it's nice that it gives you something to say, yes, okay, we're not doing that. There's something specific we can work on to improve.
Gotcha. Thank you. So almost back to the security release process. So before we go there, of course, the listeners know where we're going to end up going, which is the supply chain and all that good stuff. But in terms of vulnerabilities that are found in V8 itself or in the libraries,
yep,
what's the process there? So somebody looked at the threat model, they found something that falls inside those lines. What happens now?
So we use HackerOne, which is a service. It's free for open source projects. It lets us take reports. So if you look in our security.md, it says, hey, please report there. That gives us a nice private place to discuss them, while at the back end, we can still publish them and make them public because the project really likes to do as much transparently as we can. So in the ideal case, people report them to us through HackerOne. You mentioned things like V8. If it's actually a vulnerability in V8, often we'd pass that on to the V8 team or suggest reporting there and then do some sort of coordination. If they're in the Node core itself, we have a triage team with some volunteers that take like 2-week stints of doing the triage. We found that that's over time that's worked best. To actually have a rotation might seem a little funny to some people in an open source project, but it's actually much better because without that, we kind of fell into one person starting to get involved and then feeling like they had all the responsibility on their shoulders. Yep. So the rotation is nice so that it's clear. You can come in, you can do your work for 2 weeks, still participate in the triage discussions, but not be the primary one who has to move it forward because, the next 2 weeks, you can focus for those 2 weeks, but then the next 2 weeks, somebody else is going to take it over. So you don't have to do that forever, right? If you get involved. So things get triaged, then we of course have to figure out how to fix them. We do that. We have some private repos where we do that work. Once we're ready, and we obviously try and batch things together because it's a lot of work to do a release in particular across our like current and LTS lines. Sometimes that can be like 4 different lines that we need to do releases. Sometimes if there's different versions, you might have to do backports. And anyway, it's quite a lot of work to spin a release. So we try and batch things together and then go through that 26-step process. We have a security release stewards now who volunteer to help the releasers sort of manage the process because we've got, notifying people, sending out emails. The releasers don't need to do all of that work because they've got a big enough job. We often have 2 or 3 releasers, each doing a different line involved as well. And then we pre-announce 1 week early, and then hopefully the next week we hit the target and do the security release.
Okay, and the releasers and the people doing the triage and that stuff and fixing, actually, they're not the same people.
Yeah, so they can all be different people. It depends. Sometimes people volunteer to do the same stuff, but like we have a set of releasers who, are basically signed up, their keys are published. And so I can't remember off the top of my head, but there might be like 5 or 6 official releasers. So they're the ones who'll actually cut the release. The people who do the fixes can be different. So, once we have vulnerabilities, we try and line up people who will actually generate a fix. Sometimes the fixes are proposed by the people doing the reports. We really like that. And in fact, our bug bounty, we will pay out more if you come to us with a fix than without it. And those are sort of done. So hopefully by the time we decide we announce a release, we already have the fixes. We've tested them out to some extent in the private repos. And so what the releasers need to do is basically pull those in, run our CI tests. We lock down the public CI, run the large number of tests. And then once things are good, we actually do the release. Separately, we have, there's the people who've done the fixes. They can be different. There's the releasers who are actually going to do the release. And then we have what we've called the security stewards, which are basically helping to coordinate the whole process. So they'll actually get involved a little bit earlier. And again, we have a rotation where it's like, okay, we're going to need to do a new release. Let's agree on what the content is, what the date's going to be, making the call to say, hey, can I line up releasers? And then, we pre-announce it. So they'll be the one who sends out an email to Node.js sec, which says, hey, we've got a release coming, do the PRs to announce that on the website, post issues to the Docker and build working groups to say, hey, we're going to do a release. So, get ready. We'll need your help and all those other bits and pieces other than the actual release itself.
So the reason why I asked if they were the same people is it looks like there's a huge amount of people involved in these processes.
It takes a lot of work to get out a security release. And it really does take, for example, if we're doing 4 release lines, pulling in the commits and running the CI, which can take hours by each run, is quite a bit of work. And so, typically we have at least a couple releasers, the security steward, after we've already got the fixes. So I think people, we often get well, why haven't you done the security release already? Well, it's like, we're based on volunteers. There's a lot of work here. And that's where like the funding from the OSSF has helped us in that we've got somebody who can be a little bit more dedicated and say, okay, this is my first job, not my second job or my third job to do this kind of work.
Right. And to tell you the truth, it sounds like you've got a process that's more mature than a lot of professional places that I've seen.
Right.
And I am sure that it was not easy to get to this process. And I'm thinking that perhaps our listeners would profit a bit from hearing perhaps some things that you tried and it didn't work, or some things that you remember that went into building this process.
Definitely, like the 2 things I've mentioned, like on the triage and on the stewards, we tried where we had people who were like, I tried from, I'm with Red Hat. I was with IBM before that. And we've had a Node team and we always contributed significantly. So I tried on our team getting people whose one of their main responsibilities was to help, steward security releases or to help do triage. And that didn't even really work in terms of like, it's not a job that a lot of people want to do all the time and be the only person doing. So even when it was like, kind of like, hey, this is part of your regular job, that didn't work so well. In other cases, we had, volunteers. It was a little more ad hoc where like we'd have volunteers, but that often ended up, again, somebody would volunteer to do a little bit. And then we didn't have enough other people jumping in. So they would feel a responsibility to do more and more and more and more. And eventually that was also unsustainable. So really the rotation has I think been the thing I would say that works to make it to formalize that you can come in, you can make a commitment to do some work, but not be stuck doing all of the work, if you know what I mean, right?
Yep.
So that's the really has worked versus hasn't worked. The other thing I would say is like, people complain about those 26 steps, but we didn't make those up. Those mostly came because we were doing something or weren't doing something and somebody said, hey, could you do this? Could you let us know it ahead of time? Because, like, for example, the Docker team wouldn't know there was a release, so it would take a while before a release went out, and people would be like, hey, well, you've got the downloads, but you don't have the Docker containers updated, and so, but we need to update, right? So most of those things came out of learning that we needed to do them. And so the other thing that's worked is writing that down and having a place that we can add things to easily when we need to. I think so. The rotations, I mentioned the security stewards, having somebody help the releasers. So, like, hoping that the releasers could do all the work because it's already quite a big job. I also see the role of the steward as things go wrong, being an additional person. So sometime, at one point we would have like the releaser trying to get the release out all on their own. Having one person on their own, in my mind, is always not a good thing, right? You want other people to sort of share thoughts, problems with, like, hey, we've run into this problem. Like, these tests are not passing. What do we do, right? Like, do we abandon the release and say we're going to ship next week? Or do we look at those and say, well, we don't actually think those are related to the security release, and we're like, we're pretty confident that the changes we put in didn't cause them. Making those kinds of decisions is tough, and it's nice to have a few people making those decisions together versus having to do it together. So that's, the security steward is there to help work with the other releasers to make those kind of decisions, and having a group make those decisions is often much easier.
That is such an amazing level of commitment. And if you add on top of the responsibility of keeping something that is so critical to so many people, not only working, but working securely. So you're patching stuff, you don't want to break functionality, you want it to come out more secure than it was. It's a huge amount of responsibility. And to take that voluntarily, I mean, kudos to you guys.
That's where, we have in terms of the security stewards, we really ask that it be a commitment from the companies. So if you go to the webpage where we list the companies that have done that, because in my mind, it's like you said, it's a really large responsibility to take on as a volunteer, especially if you're not given the space by your company. So in those cases, we asked people not just volunteer, but like that their companies say, yeah, we're committed to letting you make this a priority, because I think that's important, right?
It sounds crucial. So if anybody out there is listening to this right now and say, hey, I think that I could do that, how would they get to you, and what kind of commitment would you be looking for?
Yeah, so I mean, we ask in, say, the security stewards, it's like a 2-week rotation. And then I think we have about 6 companies right now committing. It's also sort of a long-term, because there's a fair amount of ramp up. The first time you'll need somebody else to be involved. So, but really it would be like reaching out to the project and saying, like, myself or one of the other people, one of the other security stewards, to say, hey, that's something I think I can do. My company's committed my time. We, of course, want to get to know people who will do this a little bit. If you're already an active contributor to the project, that's a very good thing, because it's much easier to say, hey, Michael was volunteered, he's been contributing to Node for 2 years, we know him, therefore, we can all trust them to act as a security steward. So if it's the other thing that helps us too is if you're coming from a company and the company's making the commitment and this is part of your job, again, it's sort of that potential negative feedback loop helps to sort of say, like, okay, here's somebody we can bring into the process. But the simple answer is, if you're interested in doing that and you're already active in the project, then just reaching out to some of the existing security stewards is probably the best way to kind of understand what it would take and like how to get involved. Same with the security triage team. It's, if you want to get involved in that, you're already involved in the project, then, it's just reaching out to one of the existing people to say.
And that was my next question. Do you see a sort of progression in there? Would you prefer somebody to come in the triage level and then move to the next level?
Are sometimes a little bit different. And in fact, it's, we have some overlap between the two, but not necessarily a lot. I think that the first thing is like if you can spend some time being active in the project, that's a very good step up in terms of then volunteering to those things. However, that I shouldn't say that that's always sort of a prereq. We've had people like if you're a security minded person with lots of security expertise, we can use that skill in terms of helping to triage incoming issues, because a lot of the time they're not necessarily like node specific. They're more like, hey, this happens on Windows. And so we could use more people who are like Windows experts with some node experience versus node experts with a little bit of Windows experience, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So now it's time for us to move into that part that everybody thought that we were going in, which is the third party, the packages, the modules,
Yep.
all that good stuff. So it seems to people who may not be into the security world for a while that this whole supply chain thing is just starting now. People just started shouting and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
When we know that things like package managers like RPM and DPKJ and all that good stuff, they have been already signing packages forever and all that. How do you guys at Node see this whole thing developing, and the fact that sometimes NPM may be used as the example of hey, this is not how things should be? And what are your thoughts going forward?
Yeah, I think like Node and JavaScript is interesting in that context, in that I think a lot of other ecosystems and runtimes are moving towards having the same issue. Like Node is lots of open source, lots of use of dependent packages. So the dependency trees are quite deep. So I think we're sort of leading the wave in terms of like the biggest challenge of like lots of packages and very deep trees. But other languages are probably heading there as well. In terms of the supply chain security, I mean, I find it a little bit interesting in that like the fundamental problem is trust in the software that you're using, right? And so it's not just between supply chain security seems very focused today on the path between the publisher and you, right? So that's important, but equally important is like how much do you trust the person or project that you're getting the open source from in the first place. So there's that, even if we do a perfect job of making sure you got this package from X, well, what if X is a malicious actor and just puts in whatever they want, right? So signatures and all those things are a good piece of the puzzle, but not really the only piece. I think developing trust and how we work with those trust models is for me one of the really interesting aspects, in that I think that'll be fundamental. One of the challenges that we've talked about a fair amount in the Node ecosystem, and that we've got like a package maintenance team where we talk about packages and challenges and stuff like that, is around CVEs. And with these deep chains, you get a CVE which is reported in 10 layers down, but it ripples all the way up. Everybody has to do a fire drill. And a lot of the time, actually, it's perfectly valid CVE for that, package 10 down, but the package above it that actually has all the usage in the ecosystem doesn't even use the API that was addressed. So, the challenge there is like, what can we do to reduce that noise? Because if there's too much noise, people just ignore, if you've got 100 CVEs, critical CVEs, then like what's one more, right? So you really want to have just the CVEs that matter at your level. And so that's part which I think is not really the focus now, but I think it should have more focus. And I know there's some discussion in like VEX and stuff like that. And I think SBOMs may include part of the solution to that. So maybe we get it as, once you've got a more formalized way of saying what your content is, then you can also formalize how you say, well, and actually this dependency that I have and these vulnerabilities that it has don't apply to me, right?
Yep.
So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in and say that it sounds to me like you are dividing it into quite rightly, into the facets of trust and context, right? So trust where things are coming from, perhaps even more than how things are coming from. So it could be signed, it could be signed, but if you don't trust the person who's signing, then the signature has no value per se.
Right.
And even when you do get something that is a positive, that is a CV, then there's the context. Does that thing even work for you in terms of, are you using that piece of code? Nice. So where is the Node project looking forward in terms of getting around all that stuff? How are you guys looking at giving trust and looking at context?
Right. So, I mean, there's so the project itself. So we have working groups and we have teams, but we're not necessarily looking to solve the whole ecosystem problem under the Node project itself. We're part of the OpenJS Foundation. There's some good working groups there. We have these things called collaboration spaces at that level. So the package maintenance team, a while back worked to try and form a collaboration space around the problem that I described with the CVs and stuff like that. It's been a bit hard to make progress, but we're still hoping to revive that at one point. Concretely on the sort of the dependencies and getting experience with how you do some of that, we one of the things the security working group put in place was actually we now have a repo where we scan for vulnerabilities in our dependencies, in the Node dependency. So it's sort of like similar problem, a little bit different space. And we generate issues when there's unpatched vulnerabilities. And it gives us a place in those issues to say, well, we took a look at those and actually they don't apply to Node. So, maybe we're not fixing them. If you do a scan, scanners are going to report these vulnerabilities because of the way the system works. But at least we now have a place that you can go to and say, oh, well, the project's looked at that. They believe it doesn't apply. That's why there's no fix, right? And so I think that's sort of an experiment, at least in my mind, of can we crowdsource that information? Because we're hoping that, some of our dependencies, we had a really good case where I think it was Zip. And, the maintainer of that package said, oh, by the way, you shouldn't even worry about this because you don't use those APIs. And it's like, okay, great. They help us understand that that's not an issue. So that's a concrete thing where we're starting to generate some of that information and trying to manage it and see how useful that is. There are also efforts to look at things like SigStore and Salsa and those kinds of things within the Node context. Now, with the Node really is, like you mentioned, working in C. Node is actually like at least 50%, if not more, a C program. Like that's what we develop it in, plus then the JavaScript bindings and all the dependencies we pull in. So it's not quite the same as a package in terms of, we don't have a package JSON and the dependency list there and all that kind of stuff. So a little bit different context, but still, I think we're looking at some of those particular aspects in terms of, well, still, how do we manage the vulnerabilities reported in our dependencies? We are looking at, as I said, security's always been a good focus, but the support from OSSF has let us do some other initiatives. So, for example, we've started to, and I think we're pretty much there in terms of automating all of our dependency updates. Some of them, like OpenSSL, were quite not only labor intensive, but they ended up with like a patch of, 500 files or something. And like, who can review a 500 file PR, right? So I think it's better that it's like generated through an automated action where we, you can still get it wrong, but like, it's not like there's somebody who somebody malicious can be in there and generate those things. Hopefully it's generated by a tool that does it the same way every time. And that sort of has helped us improve from the supply chain side of things, our dependency updates. Next, we're going to look at all the tools we use to build those, because some of those we actually are not simply a copy them in. Sometimes there's some extra build steps. So we want to look at the next step of the tools that we use to do that. I mentioned Salsa as well. That's something where, we've started the process. Beth who works on the same team as I do has started looking at like, okay, how does the Node.js project meet or not meet SALSA level 1? What would it take on some of the things to move up there?
Cool. So that falls more into the trust department, it seems to me.
Right.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we at Datadog are working very hard to get the context part of it a bit better with our application security stuff and all that. And actually, we have published a small tool that tries to get into that connection between the trust and the context. And we called it Guarddog. So let me see if the gods of demo are going to cooperate with me today. This tool has been authored by, let me get the names right, by Alan Wang, by Christoph Stefani the Reaper, and Vladimir the Turkheim, which up to a short time ago worked at Datadog. And it tries to identify malicious packages, right? And it's using both sandgraph rules and metadata analysis with a bit of heuristics thrown in there. And it scans specific packages. It covers right now PyPy and NPM. It's constantly being updated, and rules are being inserted and all the good stuff. And you can use it as a CLI or a Docker image and GitHub Actions if you want to put it in your CI/CD. And here we have a very, very small, short demonstration. We are using a package off of the Backstabber's Knife collection, right? Which has been authored by Mark Ohm, Henrik Plate, Arnold Sykosh, and Michael Meyer as part of the International Conference on Detection of Intrusions and Malware Vulnerability Assessment 2020. And it's important to cite this because it's part of a work published over there, and it's a closed repository. So we like to say where we're getting things from. And what you can see here is the Docker version running, and we are going to scan a package called MariahDB and see what's in there. Oh, probably not that. See, let's try again, shall we? So as we can see, it helps to be in the right directory, makes things easier for you to find it. So here we can see just two short findings that it got in that specific package. We have that npm serialized environment, and we have the calling of an install script, which per se might not be bad, but at least now you have a pointer to go and look at things and say, hey, if you're going to use this, we know that there are some things here that indicate that there might be something malicious happening, so spend some time, go take a look at it. Again, it's part of what we're trying to put out to make the world a better place. And it's going to get better with time. There will be a pointer to the GitHub repository on the notes, but it's under the Datadog repository.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because there's lots of activity in that area.
Yes.
You know, in terms of like, hey, can we look at our packages and how do we figure out more as opposed to just the CVEs? Like that's sort of the after the fact, somebody's found something might affect you. These kinds of tools are much more, let's look for something that will let you say, yeah, I trust that package or I don't trust that package and stuff like that.
In my opinion, it goes a lot towards, in this day and age that everybody is trying for a more complete and at the same time faster CI/CD process. If we can find those things that we can put it in there that are going to give you at least some level of assurance in the things that you are bringing in from the outside, even if it's not 100%, and we know that no tool is 100%, and we know that there will be false positives and false negatives. But if you're able to leverage something that will not be like the static code analysis tools that we had seen in past years that would take 3, 4, 5 times more than the whole time for compiling to get something out of it, and it would spit 10,000 findings. But something that's going to give you some manageable stuff to look at. And if anybody looks at the repository for the Guarddog, you're going to see there that the heuristics that we use, they may not be complete in terms of we are going to find absolutely everything, but they look at the things that have historically shown to be a bit on the problematic side, like type of squatting or bits of information in the metadata that are empty and shouldn't be, or it's the first time that this thing comes in, the release is 0 or something like that. And then just throw the hooks to the source code and say, hey, this thing is calling something else when it's installing. So perhaps in RPM, again, in Debian and stuff like that, having a script that's a post-install or before the install, that's usual to happen because you have to set up and you have to clean up. But in here, perhaps it's a bit less common. So throwing up those flags and telling people something here doesn't smell as rosy as it perhaps should, perhaps it's giving them, if not full assurance, it's giving them a place to start looking and saying, do I have to pay more attention to this thing, right? And then at runtime, having the other tools that we have that can show you how things call each other, how the requests go through the whole stack and things like that, then we can definitely try and add more visibility to that good stuff.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at too is like you're saying it's not going to find everything, but it's like a piece of the puzzle. I think like there's a lot of interest in a pipeline that can get you to the point where you've got trust both from you mentioned signing, but also now like looking at the code. To see, like, not because the CV is reported, but looking at whether you said, there's any warning signs. I'll just mention, since we're at this point, Red Hat, where I work at, just announced something called the Red Hat Trusted Software Supply Chain. It's intended to help you drive those CI/CD workflows, but it's not necessarily going to have all the pieces. And like, the piece you just mentioned from Datadog, we see things like that plugging in, so you can add additional pieces of sort of information sources in your pipeline and use those to make the decisions as to like, hey, when I went through my pipeline this time, was it safe? Or there's some warning signals that I should look at. So I can see a bunch of these different tools all working together in that sort of supply chain security side of things.
And to me, it's always fascinating when we are able to get like small tools and put them in line and get bigger results. Like it's the Unix philosophy all again. And speaking of that, actually, one last thing that I think that I saw in the security MD file, and if not, correct me, there was a mention of a permissions model being added.
Yep.
And is that something that's going to happen? That's already happened? What's the status there?
It's in as an experimental feature. And it's a challenging, like I mentioned before, our current trust model is like, we trust the code that you asked us to run, right? But I kind of look at it, and there's been lots of discussions of, we also trust drivers to drive carefully in their car, but we still think like seatbelts are a good idea and airbags are a good idea, even if they're not 100%. And my personal view is so far the permissions model is a little bit like that. It's going to be hard to get it perfect so that you could never circumvent it. And that's where, like, there's been long discussions of like, well, you'll never get it perfect, so don't do anything. Or like, no, we should do something because it's like seatbelts and it helps. And I fall in the middle where it's like, it's good to be able to give people some extra seatbelts and airbags and stuff like that. And the only way we'll ever figure out if we can make it airtight is by experimenting. And so it's in there, it's experimental. There's going to be ongoing work to like find where there's gaps and how we fill those gaps. But it is something that, it's available and you can experiment to see in your particular use cases, does it help, right? And, I think the interesting thing is sometimes comes down to your environment, right? Like one of the discussions is like in production deployments, you often use containers. Those containers provide you a level of isolation, so you don't need to isolate in the runtime. On the flip side is you're often installing these modules in your development environment, and in that development environment, you're not necessarily running in containers, so there you do need it. So it may even be something that we see used more often on the developer sort of environment versus the production environments. But over time, we'll figure that out as people use it and tell us where it's useful, where it's not, that kind of stuff.
I love it because it brings up again the context is king, right? It's
right.
Not write once and run anywhere or whatever. It's every time that you're running, it's on a different context. And right now, if I noted it right, it's a flag. It's a bunch of flags, and they give you allow file system read and write, allow child process, and allow worker.
Yeah.
And somehow it brings me back to those discussions in SCE Linux and all those other frameworks. Are you guys thinking about leaving this as like absolute yes, no flags, or do you see policies coming down and things that are more granular?
Yeah, I mean, policies. So there's another feature, which is policies, but I think that's a little bit different. It's another experimental feature. But so you're basically saying, yeah, like, can we somehow group those together and figure out like, okay, apply. I think that's a natural extension. Today, we're still at the sort of walking phase of like, okay, can we sort of close some of those gaps? A number of the extra flags. So, the sort of initial thing is like, let's limit what you can access for read write. And the extra flags like limit workers, limit being able to exec processes, those I think are driven by the fact that as soon as you do those, you circumvent by default a number like that base level not being able to read or write, because either they don't inherit, I start another process that doesn't have the flag, therefore I'm not inheriting it. So I want to say, just don't let you do that. I think there's one to say like, no, it's kind of like by default, there's no, you can't use native modules. They're written in C. They can do anything, right? So unless you enable them, you can't use them. So I guess where I was going is that the flags to really control things are maybe that smaller subset. And then the follow-on ones are to enable the more dangerous things if you really think you need to do them, even though you're trying to restrict the sort of sandbox that you're running in.
Gotcha. Okay, so before I let you go, I have to say that I came to this from a learning point of view, because I am not a Node expert by any measure. And I have to say I was just extremely surprised, positively surprised, by not only the quality and the amount of work that you guys are putting in, but by the forethought and the structures that are being built around this whole thing. And of course, something that's so critical to so many processes around us. We want to see that thing, but it was really gratifying to see it. So from one security practitioner to another, thank you for the efforts to you and the whole team.
Yeah, definitely. Really thank the security working group for all the work that they're doing, and our OSSF support has helped sort of grow that effort over the last year or two.
And I'm hoping that our listeners will be inspired and be curious and want to help and participate. So do you have any kind of call to action or anything that you would like to add us with?
Absolutely. So if you want to help in things related to security and Node.js in particular, come to the security working group meetings. They're on, if you go to nodejs.org/calendar, you can find the calendar entries. Under the GitHub repo, Node.js/security, I think -WG, there'll be an issue opened a few days before. Those meetings are open, so you can join the Zoom or you can just listen in if you want. But that's a great way to meet some of the other people. We have a lot of, I'd say, sort of newer contributors, helping with the OSSF scorecard. So that's one great way to get involved. Another way I would say is just get involved in the Node project itself. We can always use more people who understand a specific area of the APIs, especially when it comes to like, okay, there's a security vulnerability. How do we triage that? How do we fix that? So that's another good way to sort of just generally help. We do have, in terms of companies, it'd be great if companies, one, we always would really hope that they would give their people time and space. And actually, the key thing is rewarding their people for contributing to the project.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say, yeah, we'll give you 20% of time, do whatever you want. But if that doesn't help when you come around to review promotion time, that we find that unfortunately that doesn't work. We need hey, we need you, we want you to do this, and we see this as a valuable thing that you're doing. That
Mm-hmm.
kind of support is really what we need. If you can't do that, then you can in addition, you can do things like joining the OpenJS Foundation to provide some like financial support. We do now have an LFX crowdfunding account where we're taking donations, not donations, but like the project part of Bug Bounty that HackerOne runs for us. So you could donate there. But really the sort of come and get involved is the top ask of people, and for the companies to give them the time. If you're using Node, I look at it as risk management, right? Like if you're running your business and you depend on Node being secure, and
Mm-hmm.
this goes the same for packages as well, the best way for you to be in the loop and to know what's going on, to being able to actually help when problems happen, is to have your people involved, as opposed to just saying, well, I'm going to open an issue saying, what are you doing on CVE XYZ? Well, a whole bunch of volunteers. If it's really important to you, come and help, and it'll manage your risk, and together as a group, we'll manage all of our risks together that way.
That's great. As they say, PR speak volumes, right?
Yep.
So
For sure.
thank you so much for your time.
Yep.
This was really, really interesting. And see you around.
Yeah, it was very nice talking to you, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. Thanks.
Hopefully.
Okay, bye.